As the Imperial Japanese Navy planned their campaign in the Pacific, they realized that the sheer vastness of the area meant that most of the time, most outposts would be far from carrier-based air cover. The very large number of relatively small islands that would be used as logistics bases or watch stations precluded construction of paved runways. There wasn't the space, and even if there were not enough engineers to build them. Japanese commanders already had an affection for seaplanes, so the logical answer was to build a modern version of an aircraft that had gone out of fashion in the early 1920s, a seaplane interceptor. The program began in late 1940 and was run by the Kawanishi Company. This aircraft was to have quite exceptional performance, fully the same as the then new Mitsubishi Zero. Kawanishi therefore experimented with numerous novel features like contra-rotating propellers and retractable belly floats. Unsurprisingly, the project's lofty ambition meant that it started to overrun. A stopgap was required. So, in February 1941, the Nakajima Company was ordered to develop a floatplane version of the Model 21 A6M2-N Rufe. The main engineer for the project was Mataki Shinobu, who had led other Nakajima projects such as the E4N and the E8N. The aircraft would be known as the Nakajima A6M2-N. The modifications were relatively simple. The landing gear was removed and a single large all-metal float was installed beneath the fuselage by means of a forward-sloping pylon and a V-shaped strut at the back. The tail wheel and arrestor hook were removed. Retractable stabilizing floats were fitted to the outboard sections of the wings, the main gear housings having been faired over. The large central float contained 330 litres of fuel, which mitigated the drop tank space lost during the modification process. Armament was the same as the A6M2-N Rufe, a pair of 7.7mm machine guns in the upper fuselage decking, and a pair of 20mm Type 99 cannons in the wings, each fed from a 60-round drum magazine. The first prototype was made from a land-based A6M2 that had been damaged in China. It first flew at Lake Kasimagara on December 8, 1941, on the first day of the Pacific War. It was still December 7th in Hawaii. Stability and handling were judged to be pretty good, although during landing the aircraft exhibited a somewhat high sink rate. The issue could be resolved by changing the flap angle during approach, but it was felt that the behavior needed engineering out. Other aerodynamic issues that testing revealed meant installing a new, higher tail and a lot of strengthening to prevent the float or parts of the fuselage being torn off if the roof had to maneuver. A small thing of note is that the headrest was removed from the pilot's seat to reduce the chances of injury in the event that the aircraft flipped over on landing. If he got down safely, during taxiing, the wind would exert significant forces on the stabilizing floats. If the pilot needed to make a tight turn, then he might find himself running out of space. This was rectified with the installation of a controllable fin on the main float that could supplement the rudder. A second prototype was delivered on the 9th of February 1942, and 5 further pre-production aircraft followed by the end of March. At this time, some magnesium alloy parts, mainly access hatches and the wing underside fuel tank access panels, were found to have corroded in the salt water. These were replaced with aluminum and the problem went away. You'll see in pictures that the cockpits were usually covered with canvas when the aircraft was floating at anchor to protect the controls and instruments from salt spray. Early aircraft were delivered to the Yokosuka-ku, the Imperial Navy's land-based test and evaluation squadron, which had also been responsible for training seaplane pilots from 1930 onwards. The Rufes were initially flown by reconnaissance seaplane pilots as they had the best understanding of how to handle a single-seat floatplane, but as the type became better understood, a more specific training program was developed. With the war on, there was not much time to assemble the first Rufe combat unit within the Yokosuka-ku, and this appears to have been formed on May 15, 1942. The first unit of 12 aircraft was dispatched to the Green Islands in the Solomon Sea, arriving on June 3rd and soon thereafter sending a small detachment to operate from Makin Island. This concept of a larger base with better facilities supporting outposts located 100 or so miles away seems to have been a feature of Japanese tactics with their seaplanes, and the Rufes were operated in a similar manner. The issue, as would shortly become clear, was that 4 Rufes was simply not enough to provide effective defense, and they were easily overwhelmed by US attackers for no real benefit. As this initial deployment took place, production lines got going. It was not really a mass-produced aircraft. 320 additional planes were built between March 1942 and September 1943 at a rate that peaked at about 30 aircraft a month. Even replacing combat losses was quite difficult given the slow rate of construction. Out in the Pacific, the 1st Rufe Squadron had numerous contacts with Allied aircraft in the first month of deployment, but no kills were scored and there were no losses in return. In early July, the squadron and the other seaplanes deployed in the Green Islands moved to the area around Tulagi so they could cover the construction of an airfield at Guadalcanal. They began operating on July 5th, and they immediately made contact. They damaged a Liberator on the 10th and then drove off a B-17 on a recon flight on the 17th, but at the cost of a Rufe shot down. They lost another aircraft and pilot on the 23rd in an attack on a formation of B-17s. The fortress was a tough target, but the relatively small number of roofs and their lack of ultimate speed made attacking a tight bomber formation hazardous in any case. This cat-and-mouse game between fortresses and roofs continued without confirmed additional results until August the 4th, when a damaged roof appears to have accidentally rammed a B-17, resulting in the loss of both aircraft. The Yokosuka coup downed another B-17 on the 5th as raids stepped up in support of the 7th of August landings on Guadalcanal. The roofs were in a harbour at Tanambogo when the raid started. 6 were floating at anchor and 2 were ashore for repairs. All of them were destroyed in the attack by strafing fighters. That should have left 1 aircraft, and Japanese survivor accounts recall seeing 1 roof still floating in the sea after the attack. In any case, the squadron was totally out of commission in the first moments of the engagement. Having been totally destroyed, the unit was reformed in October back in Yokosuka. 16 roofs were issued, and then the detachment returned to the area. Shortly afterwards, it was redesignated 801 Coup. While this detachment of roofs was operating and then being destroyed, a second squadron, 11 roofs from 802 Coup, were sent to the Shortlands from Yokosuka in August 1942 aboard the seaplane tender Kamikawa Maru. Shortland Harbour was their main base, but the roofs were typically forward deployed about 135 miles southeast to Lunga Point on Guadalcanal. Operating from sheltered lagoons with minimal onshore infrastructure, they were immediately engaged with US carrier and land-based aircraft upon their arrival on September the 4th. On September 13th, Kawamaru Makio became the first pilot from this squadron to claim a victory in the Rufe when he shot down an SPD Dauntless that was preparing to land at Henderson Field. The first Japanese losses came on the 14th when roofs escorting a strike by F1M2s were intercepted by Wildcats during an attempt to recapture Henderson Field. 3 of the float planes were lost for no kills on the Wildcats. Kawamaru Makio was killed in one of those dogfights. Although the Rufe did weigh about 15% more than the Zero when empty, it carried less fuel and the loaded weight was about the same, leading to a comparable wing and thrust loading. The Rufe's performance issue, though, was the drag from the float. Top speed was down 60 miles per hour on the Zero at 270 miles an hour. That made it 45 miles an hour slower than the Wildcat, and it precluded the use of the boom and zoom tactics that the carrier-based Zero could employ. It did, however, share the Zero's excellent anti-fighter armament setup. But, heavily outnumbered, by the 10th of October, the Rufe detachment's strength was down to 5 aircraft. The odds were massively stacked against them. That day, 2 Rufes had been escorting a Tokyo Express convoy when they were attacked by 20 US fighters. Both were shot down. By November, all but 2 of the aircraft had been destroyed in B-17 raids. Reinforcements were again brought in, and the 2 squadrons fought on until the evacuation of Japanese forces from Guadalcanal on February 14, 1943. Their last kill was on the 13th when an 802 Rufe shot down an Aerocobra on its landing run at Henderson Field. In total, 802 Coup claimed 28 kills for 22 losses. We can assume that the former is exaggerated to some extent, but the latter is correct. 802 then moved to a coral atoll at Aleutian in the Marshall Islands on March 1953, where they flew patrols until October, whereupon the unit was disbanded. Rufes also began operating in the Aleutian Islands on the 5th of July 1942, when a 6-plane unit was dropped off in Kiska aboard the seaplane tender Chiyoda. The idea was that they would cover the construction of permanent airfields on Kiska and Attu. The Aleutian campaign was a brutal one for the Japanese. Supply lines were extended, the islands were inhospitable, and they were in range of US and Canadian bases. Even so, the squadron's morale appears to have been quite high. Sortie rates were usually higher than one per aircraft per day, so there were typically more roofs aloft in the Aleutians than in the Solomons at this time. They attacked a formation of 5 B 24s on the 8th of July for no result. Their missions included patrolling looking for submarines as well as aircraft, and this led to some fairly unusual tactics. On the 12th of July, the unit attacked another B 24 formation using 30-kilogram bombs intended for attacking submarines, causing damage to one aircraft and driving the formation off. The pattern of interceptions in which the Rufes shot out their entire magazines and dropped bombs continued. They finally scored a kill on the 17th, in which a B 17 was heavily damaged and it later crashed into a mountain. Over the rest of the month, they shot up numerous B 24s and B 17s, but the tough American bombers made it back to base. Even so, for 6 lightly armoured and only moderately armed seaplanes to fly so many sorties, and at least partially reduce the effectiveness of US missions, was impressive. In early August, the unit was reformed and it received an additional 6 aircraft. It was just as well because on the 8th, a detachment of US Navy cruisers launched a raid and bombarded the harbour at Kiska. The roofs went aloft and they shot down one of the spotting seaplanes before strafing a destroyer and then spotting for Japanese shore batteries. This was only the start of the IJN's troubles. On the 30th of August, US forces had landed at Adak and constructed an airstrip within 10 days. That allowed them to stage long-range P-38s, which engaged in multiple dogfights with roofs. The end of the first roof detachment happened on the 15th. A force of 12 bombers and 28 fighters attacked Kiska. Although they fought hard and downed a P-38, all but one of the roofs were either shot down or so badly damaged that they would never fly again. 6 more aircraft turned up on the 25th, and the unit went back into action. They scrambled to defend the harbour on the 26th, losing an aircraft to a Canadian P-40 while shooting down a P-39 in return. The engagement with the P-40 is well documented, as it was No. 111 Squadron Royal Canadian Air Force's only kill of the war. It validates the idea that the roof's lack of speed meant that the pilot had to engage in a tail-chasing horizontal fight rather than a high-speed diving pass like the Zero. This report from the time told how the kill happened. The Canadian planes regrouped over the uninhabited west side of the island and had come back over the harbour when squadron leader Boomer saw a roof on the tail of a Warhawk, laying into him with machine gun fire. The battle-seasoned Boomer pulled back hard and, in his words, climbed to a stall practically, pulled up right under him. I just poured it into him from underneath. He flamed up and went down. The pilot rode it down as long as he could, then bailed out, hitting the water before his chute opened. The plane exploded on impact. Jack Chanot brought the other roof corkscrewing down, trailing a plume of black smoke. On the 29th, 2 roofs took on 20 US aircraft, again exchanging 1 for 1. This was a loss rate that the Allies could easily accept and the Japanese couldn't, at least not in such a remote outpost with poor supply. By October the 4th, none of the roofs were left on Kiska, having been lost to defensive gunfire in the P-40s, which were capable of holding their own against the seaplane. 6 more were delivered to Attu on November the 6th, but these were damaged in a storm on the 7th and finished off by US attacks. So on Christmas Day 1942, another 7 were brought in. These lasted longer and continued to score occasional victories. Their most successful day, and perhaps the best day for the Rufe all told, was on the 31st of December 1942, when the small force managed to shoot down a B-25 Mitchell and 2 escorting P-38s. When a PBY turned up to look for survivors, they shot this down as well. If US crews were not alert, then the Rufe was still a dangerous opponent, and although its armament was too light to consistently shoot down liberators and fortresses, it was sufficient against medium bombers like the Mitchell. 6 more aircraft arrived in early February, and the squadron returned to full strength, but their fortunes declined thereafter, and although they managed to shoot down a handful of Allied aircraft for minimal losses amongst their own force, the pilots were evacuated by submarine on May the 7th. Some of the unit's pilots ended up fighting in the Kuril Islands in the middle of 1943. They claimed to destroy 17 aircraft for the loss of 12 of their own in that campaign. The Rufe's next campaign was in the Aru Islands. In March 1943, a squadron of Rufes operated from the Seaplane base at Taberfane. Their main opposition was RAAF Beaufighters, Dutch B-25s, and US B-24s. They operated from Taberfane until September or October, downing 4 Beaufighters and another unrecorded type for the loss of 3 aircrafts in the air to Beaufighters, 7 or 8 lost in strafing attacks on their base, and 1 to a Liberator. The remains of this squadron, the 934 Kokutai, moved to Manokwari in western New Guinea in December to defend the area while a new base was being constructed. They apparently shot down a B-24 in their roofs before being re-equipped with the new N1K1. Many kills are unaccounted for in the patchy accounts, as the leading Japanese floatplane ace of the war, Itoku Matsunaga, flew with them, amassing 8 kills across the multiple types he flew. The Rufes also sank the submarine USS Capelin on September the 23rd. Although the type's replacement was imminent, 902 Kokutai received 8 Rufes in October 1943. They operated from Greenwich Island. On February the 17th, 1944, they rose to engage the massive US Armada approaching Truk. The Rufes were set upon by Hellcats, which shot down 7 of them and damaged the remaining aircraft so severely it crashed on landing. Despite this disaster, more aircraft were brought in and they flew in nuisance raids against the US forces without great success. After that, it's quite hard to piece together evidence of Rufe deployments. Some were used in the home islands for local defense in 1943 and 44. Apparently, a formation of Rufes engaged and shot down 2 Hellcats near Tokyo on February the 7th, 1945, but I find that rather hard to believe. One Rufe was captured by the British when they retook Singapore. It was apparently flown a couple of times by them before they handed it to the French. The French promptly crashed it on their first flight, and the only chance of seeing one of these curious but lovely machines in the flesh was taken away from generations to come. Thanks, France. Amongst the photos, you've been watching some pretty incredible footage of a Rufe being engaged by Hellcats. As you can see, despite impressive agility for such a strange-looking aircraft, it was clearly outclassed. The other threat to the seaplanes came from the elements. About 10% of all Rufes built were destroyed by storm systems. In summary then, when it was introduced, the Rufe was a good aircraft for a short war. It provided an element of surprise and an amount of protection against defensive fighters during seaplane raids, and against small formations of strike aircraft targeting Japanese shipping. But as soon as the US mobilized, the small numbers of fighters were totally outnumbered by Allied bombers whenever they deployed. Lacking speed, the Rufe never had an easy option to disengage, and its armament setup was insufficient to deal with heavier US bombers. Once fighter crews understood the type, they were able to counter it relatively easily. So it was, in my book, a limited tactical success, but part of a minor strategic failure.